On the night of March 17, 1959, a 23-year-old man dressed in a soldier's uniform walks out of his own palace. He has lived in this palace since he was 4 years old. He has been the spiritual and political leader of his people since he was a child. He has never crossed its outer wall in disguise. Tonight, he does. Outside the palace, the city of Lhasa has been surrounded for a week. Tens of thousands of his own people, farmers, monks, merchants, women carrying children, have formed a human cordon around the building to prevent the Chinese army from taking him. The army has placed artillery on the surrounding hills. Intelligence reaches the inner cabinet that the shelling will begin within hours. The young man has not slept properly in days. The state oracle has been consulted. The decision has been made. He will leave. He carries a small rifle slung over his shoulder, the way any common soldier would. His ministers, his mother, and his younger brother slip out separately, in 2s and 3s, to be reunited later. The group will number 38 when it reassembles outside the city. Two days later, the Chinese army will fire 800 artillery shells into the palace where he has lived. By then, he will be days into the mountains, traveling only at night, sleeping in the shelter of boulders, crossing rivers on yak skin coracles. 14 days after slipping out of his palace gate, he will set foot on the soil of India for the first time in his life. He will never return. And the country he has just left will not exist in the same form again. Not on a map, not in international law, not on the throne of his palace, which will stand empty from that night to this one, 67 years and counting. This is Tibet. Tibet is not a country. According to every recognized international body, the United Nations, the World Bank, the borders printed on every globe sold in every classroom on Earth, Tibet is a region of the People's Republic of China. The land is administered as the Tibet Autonomous Region. The flag flown over its capital is the flag of China. The currency in its markets is the yuan. The language taught in its schools is increasingly Mandarin. And yet, 2,500 kilometers from the empty throne in Lhasa, on a wooded ridge in the foothills of the Indian Himalayas, there is a town. Its name is Dharamshala, or more precisely, MacLeod Ganj, the cluster of buildings on the upper slope. In that town, there is a parliament with 46 elected members. There is a Sikyong, an elected political leader who serves a fixed term. There is a cabinet of ministers called the Kashag. There is a constitution called the Charter of the Tibetans in Exile. There is a Supreme Justice Commission. There are 77 schools in India and Nepal teaching tens of thousands of students in the Tibetan language. There are more than 260 monasteries and nunneries scattered across the Indian subcontinent that did not exist when the Dalai Lama walked across the Himalayan passes in 1959. The man who walked across those passes is still alive. He turned 90 years old in July of 2025. The institution he leads has been called many things over the past 67 years. A government, an administration, a diaspora, a movement, a presence, a grief. But the simplest description is also the most precise. It is a country, and it lives inside another country, 2,500 kilometers from the land it claims. To understand how this happened, and what it means for a nation to exist when its body and its soul are held in two different states, you have to begin with the land itself. The land that the Dalai Lama left. The land that, by every measure except the legal one, is still his.
The Tibetan plateau
is the largest and highest plateau on Earth. It covers 2.5 million square kilometers, an area 5 times the size of Thailand, 6 times the size of Japan, and roughly the size of all of Western Europe combined. Its average elevation is 4,500 meters. To stand on Tibet is to stand higher than the summit of any mountain in the Alps. The plateau exists because of a collision. About 50 million years ago, the Indian tectonic plate, drifting northward across the Proto-Indian Ocean, struck the Eurasian plate at a speed of around 15 centimeters per year. The collision did not stop. India is still pushing north. The plateau is still rising, about 5 millimeters a year. Major earthquakes are still common. The land is, in geological terms, still being made. What rose out of that collision is one of the most consequential pieces of geography on the planet. The Tibetan Plateau is surrounded by 4 mountain ranges: the Himalayas to the south, the Kunlun Mountains to the north, the Karakoram to the west, and the Hengduan Range to the east. Inside that ring of stone, a single landscape holds more frozen water than any place on Earth outside the polar caps. For this reason, scientists call it the third pole. And the rivers that come out of it feed almost 2 billion people. The Yangtze, China's longest river, begins on the Tibetan Plateau. So does the Yellow River. So does the Mekong, which flows through 6 countries. So does the Salween. So does the Brahmaputra, which begins in southwestern Tibet under the name Yarlung Tsangpo and travels through the deepest canyon on Earth before reaching Bangladesh. So does the Indus, which feeds Pakistan. So does the Ganges, which is sacred to 1 billion Hindus downstream. 10 of Asia's major rivers begin on this single high plateau. Nearly 1/3 of the human population on Earth lives, drinks, farms, and dies along their banks. If the glaciers of Tibet melt, the rivers of Asia change. If the rivers change, Asia changes. But up on the plateau itself, in the thin air 4 kilometers above sea level, the land that gives rise to all of this water is, in most places, a desert. The Changtang, the northern plain, is the size of France. It is empty in the way that very few places left on Earth are empty. Winter temperatures fall below -40 degrees. The wind moves in a single direction for weeks at a time. Across this empty plain wanders some of the rarest wildlife left on the planet: the chiru, the wild yak, the kiang, the snow leopard. And across it also wander people, in numbers that have not changed much in 3,000 years. The Tibetan word for them is Drokpa, the high pasture people, the nomads. Their lives are organized around the yak. A yak can carry 300 pounds of cargo across a mountain pass at 5,000 meters. Its hair is woven into the black tents of the Drokpa. Its milk becomes butter, which becomes the salty butter tea that fuels every Tibetan day. Its hide becomes saddles and bags. Its dung, dried in the wind, becomes the fuel that heats the tents through the 4-month winters. Without the yak, the plateau is not survivable. With it, it has been survivable for as long as anyone has counted. This is the land. 2.5 million square kilometers of stone and ice and grass and wind. The roof of the world, the water tower of Asia, the third pole. Most of it has never been crossed by a road. Most of what is on it has never met an outsider. It is on this land that, somewhere around 1400 years ago, a country began to take shape. The story begins with a river called the Ki Chu, in a fertile valley about 3,700 meters above sea level, surrounded by red mountains. In the 7th century of the Common Era, a Tibetan king named Songtsen Gampo unified the warring tribes of the plateau. He was 12 or 13 years old when he came to power. He would rule for about 3 decades. By the end of his life, his empire would stretch across most of Central Asia, threaten the western borders of Tang China, and possess one of the most feared cavalries in the ancient world. Songtsen Gampo did 3 things that would define the country for the next 1,300 years. He married a Nepalese princess named Brikuti, who brought him a statue of the Buddha. He married a Chinese princess named Wencheng, who brought him another statue of the Buddha. And on a hill above the Kichu River, at a place called Mapo Ri, Red Mountain, he built a palace. The palace would be destroyed and rebuilt across the centuries. The version that stands today began construction in 1645, ordered by the 5th Dalai Lama. Its outer walls took 3 years to raise. The interior, the chapels, the murals, the gold roofs, these took 45 more. It is called the Potala. It rises 170 meters above the valley floor. It contains over 1,000 rooms. It holds 200,000 statues. It is the highest palace in the world. For 3 centuries, from 1649 to 1959, the Potala was the seat of the Tibetan government and the winter residence of every Dalai Lama. The Red Palace, at its center, contains the tombs of 8 of them, gold-plated stupas inlaid with turquoise and coral, some of them weighing several tons. The 5th Dalai Lama's tomb alone is encased in 3,700 kilograms of gold. The 14th Dalai Lama left the Potala the same way every other Dalai Lama before him had left it, every winter returning in spring. But in March of 1959, he did not return. Today, the Potala still stands. The Chinese state operates it as a museum. Tourist groups, who must apply for permits in advance, climb the 1,000 stairs from the south gate and are given 1 hour inside the public areas. Photography is forbidden in the chapels. The empty throne in the audience chamber remains, untouched, where it has stood since the 5th Dalai Lama's time. A cushion is placed on it. A picture of the current incumbent is not. In modern China, possession of his image can result in arrest. Below the Potala, in the old quarter of Lhasa, there is another building, perhaps 1,000 years older. Its name is the Jokhang. It was built in the year 647 on the site of what had been a small lake. According to legend, the lake was filled in by 1,000 goats carrying earth from a distant mountain. The original name of the city, before it became Lhasa, the place of the gods, was Rasa, meaning place of the goats. Inside the Jokhang's main hall sits a small gilded statue of the Buddha as a 12-year-old boy. Tibetan tradition holds that the statue was commissioned during the Buddha's own lifetime, 2,500 years ago in India. It was brought to Tibet as part of Princess Wencheng's dowry in the 7th century. It is the most sacred object in Tibetan Buddhism. On any given morning, several thousand pilgrims walk the Kora, the prayer circuit, around the Jokhang. Many of them have walked for months, sometimes years, prostrating themselves the entire distance. From the gates of a village in Amdo or Kham, the pilgrim falls forward onto their belly, marks the place where their forehead touched the ground, rises, steps forward to the mark, and falls again. A full prostration covers about 2 meters. The pilgrim makes this gesture 1,000 times a day. The distance to Lhasa from some villages is over 2,000 kilometers. In the central courtyard of the Jokhang, the stones of the pilgrimage path are polished to a mirror's finish, worn smooth by 13 centuries of foreheads and palms. You can see your own face in them. In the year 1966, the Red Guards entered the Jokhang. The statues were smashed. The doors were boarded shut. For 10 years, the temple was used as a slaughterhouse and a pig pen. Most of its ancient murals were destroyed. The Jowo statue, the 12-year-old Buddha, was saved, in some accounts, by being hidden in a basement. Worship resumed in 1979. Renovations took most of a decade. Today, the temple has been restored, and the pilgrims have returned. But the building they pray to is partly a reconstruction. They know this. They pray anyway. The faith does not require that the wood be original. The faith requires only that the statue still be there. Buddhism did not become the religion of Tibet quickly. Songtsen Gampo brought it to Lhasa in the 7th century, but the older religion of the plateau, called Bon, a tradition of mountain spirits, oracles, and shamanic ritual, held the country for nearly 2 more centuries. The new faith and the old faith fought over the soul of the king's court. When Buddhism finally won, it was after a great debate held at Samye, the first monastery, in 792. A debate in which Indian Buddhists argued for the gradual path of study and Chinese Buddhists argued for sudden enlightenment. The Indians won. Tibetan Buddhism would inherit its texts, its monastic structure, and its philosophical lineage from India, not from China. Then, around the year 840, the empire collapsed. The last king of the dynasty was assassinated by a Buddhist monk for persecuting the faith. Tibet broke into small kingdoms. For nearly 2 centuries, the country had no central government. What remained in those 2 centuries was the religion. Tibetan Buddhism, the form that exists today, emerged in the second wave of transmission between the 10th and 12th centuries. Indian teachers crossed the Himalayas. Texts were translated. Monasteries were built. 4 major schools formed: Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, and last and largest, the Gelug, founded by the teacher Tsongkhapa in the early 15th century. The Gelug school produced the lineage of the Dalai Lamas. The 3rd Dalai Lama, in 1578, received his title, meaning Ocean of Wisdom, from the Mongol ruler Altan Khan. The 5th Dalai Lama, in 1642, became the political ruler of all of Tibet. From that point until 1959, the Dalai Lama was both the spiritual and the temporal head of the country. The line is unbroken. Each Dalai Lama on his death is believed to choose his next incarnation, a child born some years later, somewhere across the Tibetan world, who carries the same consciousness. The search teams, sent out by senior lamas after each death, consult oracles, interpret signs, examine candidates, and present the chosen child to the regent for confirmation. The 14th Dalai Lama was found in 1937 in a small village in Amdo called Taktsa, 600 kilometers northeast of Lhasa. He was 2 years old. His name was Lamo Thondup. The search party, dressed as ordinary travelers, was led to his door by signs read in the sacred lake of Lamoy Latso. When the disguised Lama produced objects that had belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama and mixed them with similar objects of no significance, the toddler picked out the originals without hesitation. According to the tradition, he addressed the search party in the Lhasa dialect, a language he had never been taught. He was enthroned in Lhasa, in the Potala, at the age of 4. South of Lhasa, in the valley of the Yarlung Tsangpo River, lies the cradle of Tibetan civilization. The Yarlung Tsangpo is one of the longest rivers in Asia. It runs east across the plateau for over 2,000 kilometers, then makes a hairpin turn at the foot of a sacred mountain and drops through the deepest canyon on Earth, a gorge 5 kilometers deep, twice as deep as the Grand Canyon of Arizona. When the river finally emerges from the mountains, it has changed its name. The country it is entering calls it the Brahmaputra. Along the upper valley, where the river is wide and the land is fertile, the first Tibetan kings ruled from a small town called Yarlung. The oldest structure they built, a watchtower called Yumbulagang, still stands on a hill above the valley, the first building of Tibet by tradition, 2,000 years old. Around it, the agricultural pattern that has fed the plateau for millennia still holds. Barley grows up to 4,000 meters. Yaks graze on the slopes above. Below the village rooftops, prayer flags hang in 5 colors: blue for sky, white for cloud, red for fire, green for water, yellow for earth. The wind reads the prayers and carries them outward. The valley feels older than the country. Far to the west, in the remote province of Nagari, rises a mountain that is sacred to 4 different religions. Mount Kailash is 6,638 meters high. By the standards of the Himalayas, it is not enormous. Many surrounding peaks are taller, but it stands alone. Its near-perfect pyramid shape, with 4 faces aligned almost exactly to the cardinal directions, has no mountaineering equivalent in the region. From every angle, it looks the same. From a distance, it looks deliberate. In Buddhist cosmology, Kailash is the earthly form of Mount Meru, the axis of the universe, the center of all spiritual worlds. Hindus identify it as the home of Shiva. Jains believe their first prophet, Rishabhanatha, achieved liberation on its slopes. The Bon religion, older than any of them on the plateau, considers it the seat of Sipaimen, the goddess of the sky. Around its base runs a single trail, 52 kilometers long, climbing as high as 5,630 meters. Pilgrims walk it in 3 days. A single circuit is believed to erase the sins of one lifetime. 108 circuits, the sacred number, are believed to break the cycle of rebirth itself. Every year, despite the altitude, despite the cold, despite the political restrictions that govern who may enter and when, thousands of pilgrims complete the Kora. No one has ever climbed Mount Kailash. No expedition has been permitted. By the explicit consensus of all 4 religions, the mountain is too sacred for human feet to touch its summit. It is today the highest unclimbed mountain on Earth that has not been climbed for reasons of belief rather than difficulty. There is a certain dignity in that, a peak that humans have agreed, across every continent, to leave alone. In the valleys around Lhasa stand 3 of the great monastic universities of Tibet. Drepung, founded in 1416, was once the largest monastery in the world. At its peak, in the 1950s, it housed 10,000 monks. They studied Buddhist philosophy in a curriculum that took 20 to 25 years to complete, a syllabus of logic, epistemology, perfection of wisdom, the middle way philosophy, monastic discipline. The Geshe degree, the highest qualification in the Gelug school, was the rough equivalent of a doctorate in theology, philosophy, and medicine, all at once. Sera Monastery, 3 kilometers north of Lhasa, was founded in 1419. It is famous for one particular ritual, the monks' debate. Every afternoon, in a courtyard shaded by trees, hundreds of young monks gather in pairs. One sits, holding a position. The other stands, attacking it. The attack is conducted with theatrical gestures, a wide swing of one arm, a stamp of the foot, a sharp clap directly above the seated monk's head. The clap is not aggression, it is punctuation. It is the sound of a logical point landing. The debate is not about persuasion, it is about pressure testing the seated monk's understanding of doctrine. The standing monk asks, if all phenomena are empty of inherent existence, what then is the nature of consciousness itself? The seated monk must answer in real time, in front of his teachers, with no notes and no preparation. The exchange can last for an hour. Ganden Monastery, the third of the Great Trio, was founded in 1409 by Tsongkhapa himself, the founder of the Gelug school. It sits 45 kilometers east of Lhasa, on the slopes of a mountain so steep that the monastery's buildings are stacked vertically, one above the next. In the years following 1959, all three monasteries were largely destroyed. Drepung was reduced from 10,000 monks to a few hundred. Ganden was demolished almost entirely during the Cultural Revolution, the assembly halls dynamited, the libraries burned. Sera was used as a barracks. All three have been partially rebuilt. Monks have returned in smaller numbers. The buildings are not what they were. The libraries lost most of their original manuscripts, thousands of years of commentary, philosophical treatise, and medical text scattered or destroyed.
But in the courtyards,
the debate continues. The clap of one monk's hand above another monk's head. The sound has not changed in 600 years. North of Lhasa, the cultivated land ends. The barley fields give way to short grass. The grass gives way to gravel. By the time you reach the heart of the Changtang, there is no agriculture left, only the sky, the wind, and the herds. The Drokpa, the high pasture people, have lived here for over 3,000 years. Their entire material culture comes from the yak. The black tents, woven from yak hair, can be raised in an hour and dismantled in less. The dwellings travel with the herd, following the seasonal grass. A family unit might cover 300 kilometers in a year. In summer, the herds graze the high pasture above 4,500 meters. In autumn, they descend to lower river valleys to ride out the worst of the winter. Children learn to ride before they learn to read. The men train horses, the women milk the yaks. The butter that comes out of a Drokpa churn, heavy, pale yellow, salted, has been the same product for 30 centuries. The Chinese state has, since the 1990s, attempted to settle the nomads, building permanent villages along new roads, offering subsidies for grazing limits, encouraging the herders to enroll their children in boarding schools. Some Drokpa have accepted, others have not. The pasture system is older than the state. It is, in important ways, older than the country. The dispute between settled life and nomadic life is one of the oldest disputes there is. On the Tibetan plateau, it is still being argued in real time. Across the Changtang and the wider plateau roams some of the most remarkable wildlife left on Earth. The Tibetan antelope, called the chiru in Tibetan, is endemic to the plateau. The males carry long, slender, ridged horns. The females are among the most extraordinary marathon migrators of any hoofed animals, covering up to 600 kilometers each summer to give birth in remote calving grounds, then returning south with their young before winter. In the 1980s and 90s, the chiru was nearly driven to extinction. The cause was the soft inner wool that grows beneath its outer coat, a fiber finer than cashmere, woven into shawls called chatouche, sold in luxury markets in Europe and the United States for thousands of dollars apiece. To make one shawl required killing 3 to 5 chiru. By the mid-1990s, the population had collapsed from around 1 million animals to fewer than 75,000. The recovery was painful, partial, and uneven. Anti-poaching patrols in the Kekexili region, many of them volunteers, fought running gun battles with hunters across the plateau. Several patrol leaders were killed. The most famous, Sonam Darji, was murdered in 1994. His death drew international attention to the trade. The shawls were banned in most major markets by the end of the 90s. By 2012, the Chiru population had recovered to around 170,000. By 2017, to roughly 300,000. They are still here. The migration still happens. The plateau is, in this one specific way, less lost than it might have been. The wild yak, ancestor of the domestic yak, is now reduced to fewer than 10,000 animals, about 1% of its historical range. It stands 2 meters at the shoulder and weighs up to 600 kilograms. It moves in herds of 200 or 300 during the breeding season, and the adults form protective circles around the young calves, horns outward when they sense a threat. A circle of wild yak in defensive formation is one of the oldest natural sites still possible on this plateau. The number of human beings who have witnessed one in the last century is probably in the low thousands. In the rocky cliffs above 5,000 meters, the snow leopard moves alone. The Tibetan name for the cat is Urbis, the snow cat. Its coat is so well camouflaged against the grey stone that it is almost never seen directly. The standard method of confirming its presence is the camera trap. There are fewer than 8,000 left in the wild across all of Central Asia. A high percentage of them live on the Tibetan plateau. In the high marshes, the black-necked crane wades through the shallow water. It is the only crane species in the world that breeds at high altitude. In Tibetan Buddhism, the crane is sacred, the carrier of the souls of departed monks. Farmers welcome its arrival each year. The cranes leave the wetlands of central Tibet in October and fly south, mostly to Bhutan and Yunnan, returning in spring. And up at 6,700 meters, on the loose scree of Mount Everest's lower slopes, higher than any vertebrate is known to live, a small, dark spider hunts. The Himalayan jumping spider is the highest-dwelling permanent resident on Earth. It survives by ambushing insects that have been blown up the mountain by storms. It does not migrate, it does not descend. It is the smallest, lowest organism in the food chain of one of the most extreme places on the planet, and somehow, alone, it endures there. "300 kilometers west of Lhasa, in the city of Shigatse, stands a monastery of golden roofs and white walls. Tashil Hunpo, founded in 1447 by the first Dalai Lama, is the seat of the second highest figure in Tibetan Buddhism. His title is the Panchen Lama, the Great Scholar. The Panchen Lama lineage and the Dalai Lama lineage are intertwined. Traditionally, the senior of the two, whichever happens to be older at any given moment, is responsible for recognizing the reincarnation of the other when he dies. The two figures are spiritual brothers, separated by a few decades and a few hundred kilometers. In May of 1995, the 14th Dalai Lama, from his residence in India, identified a 6-year-old boy in central Tibet as the reincarnation of the 10th Panchen Lama, who had died in 1989. The boy's name was Gedhun Choiki Nyima. 3 days later, the Chinese government detained the boy and his family. They have not been seen in public since. In response, the Chinese state convened its own selection process. A different boy, of similar age, named Gyaltsen Norbu, was identified through a separate procedure. He has functioned as the Chinese state's Panchen Lama for 30 years. He lives mostly in Beijing. He appears at official ceremonies. The majority of Tibetans, both inside Tibet and in exile, do not recognize him. Gedhun Choiki Nyima, the boy chosen by the Dalai Lama in 1995, would be in his mid-30s today. There has been no proof of life since the late 1990s. The Chinese government has stated, at various times, that he is alive, that he is well, that he is studying, that he prefers privacy. No independent observer has ever confirmed any of these claims. He is, in a precise legal sense, among the longest-held political prisoners in modern Asian history. He is also, by tradition, the figure who would be expected to confirm the next Dalai Lama. The arithmetic of that is not lost on anyone involved. To the east of Lhasa, where the plateau begins to break apart into deep, parallel river gorges, lies the region called Kham. The Khampa are the eastern Tibetans. Their reputation across the centuries has been for ferocity. They are taller on average than the central Tibetans. They wear long swords. The men braid their hair with red tassels. The women wear coral and silver in their hair. When a Khampa rides through a Lhasa street, even today, other Tibetans give way. In the 1950s, when the People's Liberation Army entered Tibet, the central government did not resist militarily. The Khampa did. A guerrilla resistance formed in the eastern provinces. For most of the 1950s, the Khampa fought the Chinese army from horseback in the canyons of their homeland. Their leadership, called Chushi Gangdruk, 4 rivers, 6 ranges, operated out of secret bases in southern Tibet. For a brief period between 1957 and the early 1960s, the resistance received covert support from the American Central Intelligence Agency, who trained Khampa fighters at a camp in Colorado and airdropped weapons into Tibet at night. The operation was small, partial, and ultimately abandoned when American policy toward China shifted in the 1970s. By the early 1960s, the resistance had been broken. Many fighters died in the mountains. Others escaped to Nepal, where a few hundred held out in a base in Mustang until 1974, when the Dalai Lama himself recorded a message asking them to lay down their arms in the name of non-violence. The base was disbanded. The fighters surrendered their weapons. Several of the senior commanders, unable to accept the order, took their own lives rather than be taken alive. The Khampa survived. The braids and the swords and the coral are still worn. The horses are still ridden. The reputation persists. But the war is over. It has been over for 50 years. And the question of what defending Tibet looks like now, in a century where the country cannot raise an army, has not been answered. The story of how the country came to exist inside another country is a short one. The events themselves spanned less than a decade. In October of 1950, 2 months after the People's Republic of China was founded, the People's Liberation Army crossed into eastern Tibet. The Tibetan army, small, poorly equipped, and inexperienced in modern warfare, held the border for 19 days before collapsing. By the end of October, the Chinese forces were in Chamdo. By November, the road to Lhasa was open. The Dalai Lama, then 15 years old, was rushed by his advisors to a town near the Indian border. There he waited, while a delegation from Lhasa traveled to Beijing to negotiate. What they signed, in May of 1951, was a document called the 17-Point Agreement. The agreement, in its text, recognized Tibetan autonomy in religious and cultural matters while accepting Chinese sovereignty over foreign affairs and military defense. The Tibetan delegation later stated they had been pressured into signing, that the Chinese seal of the Tibetan government had been manufactured in Beijing, that the alternative had been the destruction of Lhasa. The Dalai Lama returned to the capital. For 8 years, he and the Chinese authorities attempted to coexist. There were visits to Beijing, there were photographs of the young Dalai Lama and Chairman Mao together. There were attempts to introduce Chinese governance gradually, alongside the existing Tibetan religious administration. It did not hold. In the eastern regions, where the Khampa had begun their resistance, land reform and the collectivization of monasteries were imposed harder and faster than in the center. Refugees flowed west into Lhasa, telling stories of executions, of monks being forced to defrock and marry, of the systematic destruction of religious property. The city's mood darkened. By the spring of 1959, the relationship had broken. On March the 10th, a Chinese general invited the Dalai Lama to attend a cultural performance at the Chinese military headquarters in Lhasa. He was asked to come alone, without his usual bodyguards or ministers. The request was unusual enough that it spread through the city by word of mouth within hours. By the next morning, an estimated 30,000 Tibetans had gathered around Norbulinka, the Dalai Lama's summer palace, to prevent any attempt to take him to the Chinese camp. For 7 days, the situation held. The crowd refused to disperse. The Chinese army positioned artillery on the surrounding ridges. The Dalai Lama, inside the palace, consulted his cabinet, his state oracle, his Lord Chamberlain, a man named Thubten Wuden Phala, who had quietly, weeks earlier, sent a messenger to the Indian Consul General to inquire about possible refuge. On the night of March 17th, the answer came back: yes. He left the palace dressed as a soldier, with a rifle on his shoulder. Two days after his escape, the artillery on the ridges fired. 800 shells were directed at Norbulinka, the palace, the chapels, the meditation halls. Inside, several hundred Tibetans were killed, defending the empty residence of their leader. In the streets of Lhasa, the suppression of the uprising continued for 3 days. Estimates vary, but several thousand Tibetans died. On March 28th, the State Council of the People's Republic of China formally dissolved the Tibetan government and announced the establishment of the Tibet Autonomous Region. On March 31st, 14 days after slipping out of his palace gate, the Dalai Lama crossed the McMahon Line into India. He was 23 years old. The country he had left was, at that moment, beginning to die in the form he had always known it. The Cultural Revolution would come 6 years later. The monasteries, most of them, would not survive it. By most credible estimates, of the thousands of monasteries and religious sites operating in Tibet in 1950, only a small fraction was still functional by the end of the 1970s. A civilization of more than 1,000 years was being demolished in real time. The country in its old form was over. What began on the other side of the Himalayas was something nobody, not the Dalai Lama, not his ministers, not the Indian government that received him, had any precedent for. In a hill town in northern India, about 2,500 kilometers from Lhasa, on a forested ridge looking south across the plains of Punjab, sits a place called Dharamshala. The British had built it in the 19th century as a summer retreat for officials of the Raj. A small hill station, a few churches, a regimental cemetery. Earthquake damage in 1905 had partly emptied it. By the late 1950s, it was largely forgotten. In May of 1960, the Indian government offered it to the Dalai Lama as a residence. He has lived there ever since. 66 years as of this writing. What grew up around him is the closest thing the modern world has produced to a transplanted nation. The Central Tibetan administration occupies a complex of buildings on a ridge above the main town. It has 7 departments: religion, home, finance, education, security, information, and health. It runs more than 70 schools across India and Nepal. It maintains 40 agricultural settlements. It operates a parliament that meets twice a year and a court system that adjudicates internal Tibetan civil cases. Its citizens, about 150,000 registered Tibetans worldwide, carry a small green book that records their annual voluntary contribution, which functions as both an identity document and a tax. The administration's operating budget, drawn almost entirely from donations and the Green Book payments, is roughly $30 million a year, less than the annual budget of a single embassy in Delhi. The leader of the political administration is no longer the Dalai Lama. In 2011, at the age of 76, he transferred all political authority to the elected Sikh Yong. He retained only his spiritual role. The current Sikh Yong, Pempat Sering, was elected in 2021. In effect, an entire constitutional democracy was built in a foreign country, on borrowed land, from a refugee population in roughly 2 decades. There is no other case quite like it in the 20th century. On July 6, 2025, the Dalai Lama turned 90 years old. The celebrations in Dharamshala lasted a week. Tens of thousands of Tibetans arrived from settlements across India, from monastic communities in Nepal, from the diaspora in Europe and North America. Indian government officials attended. Delegations came from Taiwan. Messages of support arrived from the United States Congress and the European Parliament. The Dalai Lama said, that week, that he hoped to live another 40 years. He said he hoped to be alive at the age of 130. He said the institution of the Dalai Lama would continue after his death. He said the search for his reincarnation would be conducted exclusively by his own trust, the Gadan Phodrang, and not by the Chinese state. The Chinese government issued an immediate response. The selection of the next Dalai Lama, it said, would be made in accordance with Chinese law and would take place in China. So there will almost certainly be 2 next Dalai Lamas. One, chosen by the Gadan Phodrang Trust, born somewhere in the free world, somewhere outside the People's Republic of China. The other, selected by the Chinese state through whatever procedure it determines, born inside the borders that the state controls. The next generation of Tibetan Buddhists will inherit from this moment the question of which one to follow. And here, in the year 2026, the paradox of the title becomes literal. There is a country called Tibet. It has a government. In Dharamshala, it has a leader, for now. It has a parliament, a court, a constitution, a school system, a flag, a national anthem, a currency once used, a language, a religion, a diaspora. And there is also a country called Tibet, which sits on the high plateau where the Yangtze and the Brahmaputra are born. It has its monasteries, partly rebuilt. It has its monks, fewer, more closely watched. It has its pilgrims, still walking the Barkor circuit, still falling forward onto their bellies on the road to Lhasa. It has its empty throne in the Potala, with the cushions still in place.
Both countries are real.
Neither is complete. They have not been able to merge for 67 years. The man who walked across the mountains in 1959 is what has held them together. His memory, his voice, his presence on a stage in Dharamshala every few months. These are the connective tissue between the land and the institution. He is 90 years old. The connective tissue is fraying. Persistence is not a guarantee. A country can survive losing its government, its army, its territory, and most of its monasteries. Tibet has survived all of those things. What it has not yet had to survive is losing its embodied center, the single figure, alive in the world, who has held the two halves of the country together through one long lifetime. The 15th Dalai Lama, when he is found, will be a child. Tradition holds that the search begins 3 or 4 years after the previous Dalai Lama's death, long enough for the new incarnation to be born and recognizable. The child will then be educated in monastic robes from the age of about 5. He will not be ready to lead, in any meaningful sense, until perhaps his 30s. The institution will be carried in the interim by regents and the Sikyong and the parliament, and by the elders who still remember the country before it broke apart. By the time the next Dalai Lama is grown, the generation that walked across the Himalayas in 1959 will be gone. What will the country look like then? The question has no answer yet. There may be answers that emerge in the next 20 years. There may be answers that take a century. The institution has, in its own internal time, all the time it needs. The institution measures in incarnations. It does not measure in news cycles. In Lhasa, the Kora continues. Pilgrims still walk clockwise around the Jokhang. The polished stones of the courtyard still mirror the faces of those who pray. In Dharamshala, the parliament meets twice a year. The schools open in September. The monasteries take in new novices. In the Changtang, the Chiru still migrate. The wild yak still forms its defensive circle. The crane still flies south in October. The Drokpa still pitch their black tents on the same passes their grandfathers used. And somewhere, in a quiet room in Dharamshala, a man who is now 90 years old continues to wait. He waits, he speaks, he meditates. He is the longest-living Dalai Lama in the recorded history of his lineage. He is the longest-running exiled head of state in the modern world. He is the connective tissue between a country and the country it became. On the day he is gone, the question of how Tibet exists and where it exists will enter a phase no one currently alive has lived through. Until then, the country goes on, in both forms, in neither form complete. This has been Tibet, the country that exists inside another country and outside it, and across the mountains that separate the two. Thank you for watching.